micromolar in your plasma. And that's concentration you have in your plasma. And if we give that to our subjects and we ask them before you are going to exercise, have you taken caffeine or placebo? They cannot feel any difference. After they have performed, they know when they have got caffeine many of the times. And what are the concentration we need? Well, you see here they have done studies. They saw placebo, and if, again, a study time to exhaustion, and if they take caffeine, they run longer. If they take 3 and 6 milligram, and if they do 9, they also run longer, but it maybe go down. So, and some people have claimed that the optimal concentration for caffeine is in the range of 3 to 6 milligram per kilo body weight. And that means this is about 200 to 300 milligram of caffeine per person. And if you take this, you will never reach the level that was on the doping list before. So this is quite low concentration. And that's also concentration that is considered completely safely. That's about 3-4 cups of coffee. So not more than that. So another study showing that caffeine can improve performance. If you are a biochemist or pharmacologist, you can also see how does this caffeine work. And one of the things they know is that it is an adenosine antagonist. So it binds to the adenosine receptors and prevent adenosine to work. And this is KD. This does the concentration that you need to make half binding concentration. So this is 12, 2.4 micromolar, 13 micromolar, and 18 micromolar. So these adenosine receptors are sensitive to caffeine at concentration we get just by drinking 1 cup of coffee. And many people will feel that they are a little bit excited just by 1 cup of coffee. We know also that caffeine can stimulate calcium release from the cells, and that was how they started to study calcium fatigue, because when you get fatigued, your muscles will not be able to stimulate calcium release, but if you had the caffeine, you could get out a little bit more calcium, and you could make a bigger force. It's also well known that caffeine inhibits this phosphodiesterase molecule that breaks down cyclic AMP, and it's also known that it inhibits phosphorylase A. And we showed some years ago that it also inhibits this PI3 kinase as a physiological concentration. And some studies have shown that if you take caffeine, you can reduce cancer risk, and this is a molecule involved in cancer. So there is a lot of possibilities how caffeine can work, and in sport, it's probably this one, because these adenosine receptors are also involved in pain. So if you exercise, and if you really exercise hard, I think many of you have felt some pain. And if you have the caffeine, you reduce this pain. And maybe also here that you could get a little bit more calcium release. And this is not just to show how it works, that normally you know ATP, and you also know that it's broken down to ATP, and you probably also know the molecule AMP, and you know this activates this AMP kinase, but ATP is also a signaling molecule, so it's transported out, and when it's transported out, it can be broken down to AMP, and AMP can be converted to adenosine, and adenosine will then bind to these receptors. And what caffeine does, it will bind to these receptors and prevent adenosine to work. And that's what we believe, that when we get tired in the evening, that we will have some more adenosine extracellular in our brain. And when we get this adenosine in the brain, we get a little bit more tired, and caffeine will bind and prevent this tired development of fatigue. So when we do in sport nutrition, and you're talking about the Olympics and things like that, then I also know that when you do this stuff, it's only one thing, that's the competition itself. So if we are going to, how are we going to test performance? And you can say endurance capacity, keep a high intensity over time can be important in marathon running. But sometimes it's more important that you can get really a high aerobic capacity, shorter distance, like 300-meter runner. If it's competition between 2 to 8 minutes, it's more important to have a high than you can maintain it for a long period of time. You also have the anaerobic capacity, like if you do 800 meter, 400 meter running. And you also have the strength development of force, and sometimes it's about speed. And then you can say all this, you have these capacities, and then this is impaired by fatigue, that at one stage it will not be able to do it, and sometimes it will be able to continue to develop to the exercise, but you just have to have a larger effort. And when we talk about fatigue, we often talk about two, the peripheral, something going on in the muscles, or something like central fatigue. Can you continue to do the exercise? And you say, are you motivated? And where does caffeine work? This is just some data from our lab. We asked people to ride the bike at I think it was 337 watt, well-trained subject, and we asked how tough is this, and then we used the Bohr scale, and they rated very, very light, fairly light, somewhat hard, very hard, very, very hard, and when you start out, it's fairly light, and then after 15 minutes, it's become a little bit tougher, and after 1.5 hours, they score it becomes very, very hard, and they are not able to maintain the exercise intensity. So these people, they do the exercise in the beginning, it's very, very easy, and at the end, it's much harder. So then you can say what limits performance, and we have the peripheral fatigue. And what we have is that to do muscle contraction, you need to get calcium release from the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, bind to the actin, and caffeine has some action here. So this rhodidine receptor, so caffeine will bind to these receptors, and maybe it releases a little bit more calcium, so you can maintain a bigger force during your exercise. But what people believe is the main action of caffeine is on the brain, because if you are going to do some exercise, it's the motor cortex who run your muscles, and all these signals coming down to the motor neurons, they get a lot of impulses, and some of them say to go, and some of them say to. You also get feedback from the muscle and to explain that you start to become fatigued. And your brain, you have other area into the brain, they go faster, and some impulses come in and say go slower. And here they believe that adenosine is the molecule that go in and tell you are fatigued, try to go a little bit slower. And if caffeine come, you will sort of take that go slower effect a little bit away. So when we are going to test the effect of caffeine, of course, like if you are athletes, there's only one thing that matters, and that's the competition. Does caffeine improve your chance to win? And I know in Norway, I know in Denmark, a lot of athletes, they use caffeine. And the data we have, I will also say, I will not send an athlete to Olympics without giving him caffeine with, because if it is not big effects, then it's not big effect that is between the first and the second place. What we can do in the lab, we can test people, and what we do is we put them on a bike and we ask them to ride until exhaustion for a period of time, and we see if caffeine can improve that. We sometimes do time trial, and some people claim that this is much more sports relevant type of test. We can put them on a bike and we can ask them to ride 50 kilometers or something like that, or we can also put them on and say do as much work as you can in 10 minutes. And that's more about increasing the work capacity. Work capacity, we have done some work to see the effect of maximal oxygen uptake on maximal jump height and maximal. We have not done anything on running speed, others have done that. And again, what is the mechanism? That's what we would like to find out. We are doing our research in Norway at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and this is sort of the most the exercise we are doing a lot. You do your arm and you do this double pulling, and they can do this for some races is 90 kilometers, and they can do this in 90 kilometers. They just run like that. So they are quite well trained. And also one thing, the reason we did is that the metabolism in the arms are different from the legs. The arms, they don't like to use fat. They like to use carbohydrates. So even if you do this, lactate is released there from the arm and go to the muscle, and they prefer the glycine. This just in competition. We also do some work on running. We do work on cycling, but we're not done caffeine. And there's also been a lot of studies showing positive effect of caffeine in swimming. So most of this stuff. So this is just one of our studies. We have these people there in doing their double pulling. And what they do, when they do this double pulling, and we ask, how tough is it? And in the beginning, we increase the load. And if we go up on these load, they scored just a little bit easier. Not something they don't feel anything, but they scored less hard when they do caffeine. And even though they scored less heart rate is the same, and oxygen consumption is also the same. So they need the same energy, the heart do the same number of beats, but still they feel it's easier. And then we did the performance test, and here they did 8 kilometers double pulling. That's about 35 minutes. And we have a placebo, and we have a caffeine, and they improve performance. And that's just all the way. They just run a higher speed with caffeine all the way. Here they go a higher heart rate all the way. And if you do such of a time trial, they'll do all the way, score the pain. They sort of, to do this time trial, it's just about how much pain you can do in your arm. So that's how you do it. So here, it's no effect of pain in the arms or the leg, but they do a little bit higher heart rate. And in fact, I think we had 10 subjects, and there are 2 of them that did not respond, but 8 of them responded well. And then you can say, what is 1.25 minutes in 35 minutes? And at that year, my students said that had been a world championship in skiing, and doing the 15 kilometers was about 35 minutes. And if you add 1 minute and 25 seconds, then you go from number 1 to, I think he said, number 15. So that's quite a big difference with caffeine, that you can improve your performance by one and nearly 1.5 minutes. So that's a big difference. A lot of time when you have competitions several days in a row. And of course, if you do caffeine, you press your body harder. So the next question we address, if you work harder, what about the next day? Will you be more tired, and will your performance be impaired the next day? And what we did here was that we tested them. Here we had another test. It was 10 minutes all out. And you see how the speed they could do. And again with caffeine. A nice, solid effect of caffeine. And if the marker we used for muscle damage was creatine kinase. So we saw the first day, no difference. After exercise with caffeine, the next day, they had elevated creatine kinase concentration in the activity in the blood. And we will normally say that's bad for performance. This is muscle damage. But when we asked them to do the test again the next day, we saw again caffeine put the performance completely back. So what we can say is, yes, caffeine, you perform better, you may challenge your body more, but the next day, at least in this double pulling, they were back on the same performance with caffeine. And with the placebo over here, if anything, it in fact goes down a little bit. So caffeine, even the next day, we could see that you had a performance enhancing effect. This study, we challenged, the test was 10-minute time trial. And what we saw in this time trial was that we measured oxygen consumption during this last 10 minutes. And in some of these subjects, we reached the all-time best in oxygen consumption. We also saw that the heart rate was higher than we had measured on any of the other tests. So one of my students, he said his heart rate was 6 beats higher than he could normally do, whatever. So, and a lot of time if you do endurance per sport, what limit performance? That's the capacity of the heart to pump blood to the muscles. So we saw these data that was really strange. So we went out and said, why does it increase performance? And one of the things we then went up to see was that is it an increase in maximal oxygen consumption or is fractional utilization? And we took the hypothesis, is caffeine, can that increase maximal oxygen uptake? And we did a study here, and here we had 24 athletes, and the mean oxygen consumption is 76. I think that's quite high. The highest we had 93. We had a junior world champion. We had 2 Norwegian champions as subjects. So we had really, really well-trained subjects. So the first thing is we had a performance test, and here was we just increased the speed on the treadmill gradually, and they run until exhaustion. We increased it half a kilometer every 30 seconds, and they ran longer. They ran 20 seconds longer, and 20 seconds it's not that much, but when you go on this speed, it's again a substantial difference. You go. We saw an increase in maximum oxygen consumption. You cannot see that, but statistically it's highly significant. They ventilated a little bit more. The heart rate came a little bit higher. But the heart rate was, in these 24, it went up by 2 beats in this study. And that might not seem a lot. Maximal oxygen consumption increased by 1.2%. But if you go on elite athletes and you're going to the competition, that is something like between number 1 and number 5 or 10 in many competitions. And again, if you go on the performance, they ran 6% longer on time to exhaustion. And what they do, they ventilate a little bit more. Their heart rate is a little bit higher, but they can also do a higher anaerobic capacity, and always when we do this, they end up with a little bit higher lactate concentration. So you can really push yourself harder, and you can also get your maximal oxygen consumption up just a little bit. And this is not easy to study this. So if you see we have 24 athletes, that's what we need to get really solid data. That we have done a little bit work at altitude. We have an altitude chamber, so we just put people in the chamber, and we put them up to 2,000 meters for 2 hours. We had 13 competitive cross-country skiers. We gave them 4.5 milligrams of caffeine, and then we asked them to do 90% of maximum oxygen consumption until exhaustion. And here you see 6 minutes, and again, a big effect of caffeine. And again, heart rate is higher. Adrenaline concentration, lactate, they go lower in bicarbonate, and also glucose concentration goes higher. That's what we see all the time when we do this stuff. So yes, if we do such a time to exhaustion, they perform better in altitude. What people then say is that we would like to see a time trial that you go out and do some performance that is more relevant for sport, and then we did the 8-kilometer double polling. And here we see we did that at sea level, and we go to altitude. When we go to altitude, performance is poorer. It takes longer time to do these 8-kilometer double pulling, but if we do the caffeine, we saw no effect. And the reason was that if we had asked them to do 4 kilometers, they did significantly better. But to go to the altitude, your body does not respond as you're used to. So a lot of people, they felt that it's quite easy. So they started out extremely hard. And then after 4 minutes, or 4 kilometers, half the time, they had a really tough time to do it. So, the effect of caffeine in altitude is not that clear. We have done just a small study where we have had some of our young, well-trained subjects, and we did this counter movement jump. You just ask them to go down and jump as high as they can. And again, we train our subjects in the lab 3-4 times before we start to do the test. And we had 6 subjects. All subjects jumped higher with caffeine, double-blinded, 2 centimeter. But again, 2 centimeter, if you go at the world competition in high jump, mostly you have 3 or 5. They do the competition within 2 centimeters. So this is again, I would say, significant results, important results. And I looked in the literature. There is another study where they asked people to run 12 sprints of 30 meters, and what they were asked just to run as fast as they can, and they saw the 3 first sprints was running faster. That fit well with our data that they can jump harder. But if you run faster, it has a cost, and at the end, there was no effect. But the sprinting performance seems to be a clear effect. So if our conclusions is that caffeine increases time to exhaustion at a fixed workload, that we get a huge effect of caffeine there. We can also see that improved performance at time trial, quite substantial effect. When we do that, we don't see all effect. Mostly we have 20% that do not respond on caffeine, and there are also some mutations in the humans that may explain that it does not work. We also see that it improved anaerobic capacity, in particular if it's the longer period, like when they run 4 or 5, 6 minutes, then they get a substantial increase in anaerobic capacity. We have seen jump performance. We have not published these data, and not much data out there. But our data, I really put up them, and I think they are good. And I also see the running speed. These data seem also something about quite solid. If we go on muscle strength, the data is much more unclear. And one of the reasons is that if you're going to test 1 IM and stuff like that, and if the improvement is 1 or 2%, it's not that easy to do this, and they do some isokinetic strength. But there are some studies that show you improve strength, but many students do not find a positive effect. And if you're going to do some advice, then it's simple, like 3 to 4.5 grams of caffeine per kilo. And you could probably have done 2.5, so you can do 200 or 300 milligrams in tablets. You just give it 1 hour before competition. You can do caffeine or powder. That was what I would recommend. And I'll also say that we have some subjects where we don't see any effect. And one of them, he was a Norwegian champion is in cross-country skiing. And we said, do you not use this? He said, no, it doesn't work on me. And most other people, they use it. And some of these subjects, we have tested them with and without caffeine 4 times. And a few subjects, 20% maybe, 10, they do not really respond to that. If you do long competitions, like cycling, maybe it's better to add this in the last part of the race. I don't know. There's not much data out on that. And if you go to the altitude, the effect is much more unclear. But that's easy, and I think that's some people will most people will use that. Many people use that during Olympics and competitions and stuff like that. So most of these data is from a PhD students, Hans Christian Startheim, but a lot of other students are involved, and my technicians, and one measured this. And we have had John Ivey as a collaborator on one of these studies. So thank you for your attention.